hear me, please, in the super chat by putting yes or no? Can everyone hear me? No? Do you think maybe it takes a minute?
You're not on. Now you're on.
Right, guys, can you just confirm that you can hear me, please, in by putting yes or no? Can everyone hear me? Okay, that's apparently a yes. Yes. Brilliant. Fantastic. Okay. And can everyone hear Dan? Dan, if you can just test that you can be heard.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Brilliant. Fantastic. So let's begin then. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The Lord will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will volunteer freely in the day of your power. In holy array from the womb of the dawn, your youth are to you as the dew. The Lord has sworn and not changed his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings in the day of his wrath. He will judge amongst the nations. He will fill them with corpses. He will shatter the chief men over a broad country. He will drink from the brook by the wayside. Therefore, he will lift up his head. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, guys, for those of you that do or do not know, the gentleman that you see on the screen with me is a gentleman called Dan Gibson. He is someone who has spent many years, I'm going to let him introduce himself more fully, studying the archaeology of early Islam, and has come up with a theory, a hypothesis that draws into question the traditional understanding of the history of Islam. He'll correct me if I'm wrong. His name is Dan Gibson. Dan, would you like to take a minute just to introduce yourself more fully? Correct me if I've misintroduced you in any way.
Okay, no, that's fine. I've been working on this for a lot of years. It started out more or less as a hobby, and then by 2010, I was working on it full time and have been working on it full time ever since. So laid everything else aside, and this has been my focus for the last 10 years, ever since having first discovered back in 2010 the direction of the mosques. It's called the Qibla, the direction a mosque faced, and I began to realize something was wrong with the Qiblas. And so I started a study in 2010 of all of the Qiblas of these mosques. Before that, I was working on the Nabateans, the people who lived in Petra, and so forth. And this just was a side project. And suddenly I had been over the years realizing there was something wrong with Islamic history that didn't add up. And it was in 2010 that it suddenly clicked. It was a geographical problem, and that seemed to solve all of the issues that I was looking at, but it created some new ones, of course.
Okay. Enough. So this has been like your personal passion, your personal obsession, as it were.
The obsession is a good word.
Obsession is a good word. Okie dokie. So just to crack on then, you mentioned that in your early studies of Islam, you were finding mosques that pointed towards Jerusalem. Could you tell me from what period these mosques were? Where did you find them? And did you see them personally, or was it other people who told you about them?
It started off with personal visits. I lived in the Middle East since 1979 and traveled during that time to a lot of the different sites. And in a number of different places, people would say, oh, this mosque faces Jerusalem. And I would just tuck that away in the back of my mind and think, okay, he said it faces Jerusalem. So that's why I was aware there were a number of mosques in different places, and people would tell me about them, or I would be visiting and they would say, this mosque faces Jerusalem. And that's where I realized there was some conflict. There were too many mosques that faced Jerusalem and too far apart. Like there were mosques in Oman that faced Jerusalem, mosques in Salalah in Oman, as well as over by Muscat. That's a long ways away. And how do you fit that into Islamic history, that they would actually build a mosque there that faced Jerusalem? So I needed to actually visit each of the mosques. In the end, I determined that none of them faced Jerusalem. That was my conclusion in the end. So, but at the beginning, people would just say they realized their mosque wasn't facing Mecca. They would say, oh, this one faces Jerusalem because it's in that general direction. But nobody was measuring at that point to try to see where do they face.
Okay, so people were saying mosques were facing Jerusalem. You started to look into that. You discovered that they're not facing Jerusalem. Just for the novice like myself, because as you already know, I'm someone who is interested in your position, but I'm slightly skeptical. So just explain to me and to any other novices that are listening into this, how do we define the facing of a mosque? How do we define where a mosque is facing?
That depends on the time period, because mosque construction changed very specifically at a certain point in time. So today, if you go into a mosque, you will see a niche built into the wall, a round curved niche, and that is called the mihrab niche. And so that's the direction that a mosque faces. And if you're on the inside, the niche is very obvious. When you go to the very earliest mosques built in the first 50, 60 years of Islam, they did not have a niche. That came later. And I would have to look up the date. I could do it very quickly if you want the actual date. But the mihrab was invented at a later date. The very first mosques had no date. They had a Qibla wall that was just a flat wall that people would line up in. And this is the way a mosque is constructed, is very different from, say, a British cathedral. I had the opportunity to be in some big British cathedrals, and I realized these are very long, narrow buildings because of the way that they had to be constructed. The roof couldn't go that wide. So in Islam, they put a lot of pillars in it, but they had one long wall was the Qibla wall, and then the people lined up facing that wall. So you have a choice of 4 walls. Now, not all of the corners are square. This is where a lot of people get messed up when they start to look at a mosque and think, well, okay, let's just measure the side walls. That's because they're assuming it's square, where a lot of the early buildings were not square. They didn't have anything that made them think it's got to be square. Many buildings actually were on a slant like this. I mean, but you looked at the long wall, and if you go inside, if it was still surviving, there's usually something on that wall that would indicate everyone can line up and face this wall. There wouldn't be some obstruction along the wall. It would be just a very long wall that you could face. And so we can go 90 degrees off of the Qibla wall and see. Sometimes we have to check all 4 walls to see where they're facing, and then realize, okay, this is obviously the Qibla wall because it's got a direction that makes sense.
And when you say a Qibla wall, what is that sort of pointing? I mean, I know we're going to be discussing where it's pointing, but in terms of the idea behind the Qibla wall, what should it be facing?
It's the direction that the people who are praying face. So I don't like to say it's pointing because it doesn't point. It's that everyone who's standing behind the wall is facing. If they're standing up straight, shoulder to shoulder in lines like they're supposed to line up, then all of the congregation are facing towards something. And the Quran tells us they are to face Masjid Al-Haram.
What is the Masjid Al-Haram?
That masjid is a gathering place, and it comes from bowing down. So it's the place where you gather. Haram comes from the word harem we have in English. It means it's forbidden. So the original place, all the tribes could come together into this place of worship, which is masjid. Everybody bows down. This place of bowing down, worshiping together. So it means it's forbidden for you to kill anybody, to fight anybody. It's forbidden to, it was a place of safety. So if there were tribes that weren't talking to each other, or maybe were even at arms with one another, once they entered the sacred precincts that were marked out by stones, they were in Masjid Al-Haram, the forbidden place. You wouldn't even tear up trees or bushes. You wouldn't kill animals. There's lots of stories of early Muslim people who were very hesitant to even trample on a bird or something, because that was the forbidden area where everyone was safe and secure inside of it.
So these early mosques,
we will discuss where is that, because that's a big question. It doesn't say face the Black Rock. It doesn't say face Mecca. None of that was said. It just said face Masjid Al-Haram.
So the Quran, from your reading, doesn't say face the Black Rock, and it doesn't say face Mecca.
No.
There's no clear statement in the Quran about that.
Not at all. The word Mecca only appears once in the Quran, and it has nothing in that where that is to give you any idea that's talking about prayer or worship or anything.
But it must describe, let's put it in quote marks, it must describe Mecca, we're just sticking it in quote marks for the moment, but it must describe Mecca in the Quran. It must describe things
the Quran. The Quran. Now, this is something to do with vocabulary. A Muslim will tell you the word Mecca, M-E-C-C-A, only appears once. It would be in Arabic as well. So it only appears once in the Quran. But there are other words that are used. So we have the Kaaba, which is the building that houses the Black Rock in the corner. So it talks about the Kaaba. It talks about the house, just sometimes mentioning the house. And so there are different terms that are used, but not specifically saying that they are in Mecca.
Okay, and that's important, because people are reading, Muslims today will read the Quran and they will see these terms, and in their mind these terms are associated with Mecca.
Yes, and if you Google Masjid Al-Haram today, it will take you to Mecca in Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. However, there's nothing actually in the text that identifies these places, like the house, the Kaaba, that kind of thing. Nothing specifically stating clearly that it's in Mecca per se. And that's why it's important then to look at archaeology to see what archaeology can tell us about what these texts are talking about.
That's right.
Okay. So you mentioned in your writings and in your videos that there was more than one Mecca. Could you expand upon this? Tell us a little bit about what the evidence is for this.
Okay, I'm just pulling up my notes on the side here. In the histories, and we have, like behind me here, I have Al-Tabri's history and some of the other histories, Ibn Hisham and Ibn Sa'd and so forth. These guys wrote down histories. They refer to Mecca. So the word Mecca appears many times in these histories. Now, remember, they're writing about 300 years after the events took place. And so the word Mecca appears in lots of places. And so everything is called Mecca. What really got me thinking about this is I wonder if different places had the same name, just like today. It can be very confusing if you come to Canada and then decide you wanted to go to Stratford-on-Avon because we have one here, as you have one there, and it's on a river, and so forth. So it's, there can be multiple places with the same name. The question is and the thing that came really to a point was reading a man named Thomas Artzruni. He was an Armenian writer writing about the history of the Armenians. He's writing about 300 years after Muhammad. And so he's writing about the same time that Al-Tabari is writing over here. And he talks about Mecca, and he says Mecca is in Arabia Petria. This is the word that he uses. We'll have to describe that. And then he says Mecca, and then he says, to emphasize, it's the Mecca. Just so you get it correct, he's talking about the Mecca, and it's in Arabia Petria. Now, Arabia Petria is a Roman term, and when I say Roman, I not only mean the ancient Roman, but also the Byzantine Empire, which were still called the Roman Empire at that time, and the Muslims referred to them all as Romans. Arabia Petria is the Arabia of the two Petras. Petra means rock. And so the province was called Arabia Petria because there were two great notable rocks in it. The first one is Petra, that we would know today with the city of Petra in Jordan. The next one was, I would think maybe about 60 kilometers north of Petra, is a great rock known as Sela. And this was the original major holding place of the Nabateans where they did their trade from. So it was known as Arabia of the two Petras. So that province does not go any farther south than Aqaba, which is the Red Sea, and it went all the way up. It passed Basra in Syria. So just to give you an idea of this province that had the Decapolis, the 10 cities in it. It has Basra as the capital city. Petra was not the capital city. Maybe it was for a little while, but generally that was in Basra in the north. And so he is saying that Mecca is in Arabia Petria, and he says the Mecca, and he does it when he's talking about Muhammad and how he's gathering people around him and so forth. So he's describing Muhammad, and he's describing the Petra. He says it's in Arabia Petria. So for me, that's a very strong clue that the original Mecca was in that province. But what we probably should do is back up and talk about the archaeological evidence.
I was just going to come to that. Like,
Okay.
what are the? So we've got one line of evidence, this testimony of the Armenian historian talking about the Mecca, and he's referring to a city further north than the old Mecca. What are the kind of evidence do we have that would seem to identify Petra as being the Mecca, that this Petra as being the place that's being described by Islamic literature?
Yeah, that goes back to 2010 when I was doing my research. I thought it would be a very quick project, just get a quick little chart on one page of what I was writing, and here are the early mosques that face towards Jerusalem. When I started to actually examine those mosques, I quickly discovered that there was a lot of controversy around them because they did not face Jerusalem. They all faced south of Jerusalem. So they missed their target. And then I began to say, I need to measure all the mosques of that period. I mean, I'm just that kind of guy. I need to know, I got to look at all of them. Like, I need the big picture. And so I just began to started Googling where, these different early mosques and getting a list. And then as I started working on it, I started asking other people, and slowly I got more and more input from different people just that lived out there, also scholars looking for mosques. I'm still looking for mosques for the first 200 years of Islam so I can get a good picture. And so people are still writing in, and the database is continually being changed and upgraded and so forth. I thought I was only going to find a couple of mosques. I ended up in the first 100 years of Islam finding over 20 mosques that still survive to this day. The problem is there are others have been torn down and rebuilt and torn down and rebuilt. and you can't measure using those anymore because there's no more foundation. Some of them were very small, and suddenly now today you go there and they house 2,000 people. I mean, the original foundation is totally gone. So can't use those. So I'm using the ones where we still have a surviving foundation or a very good description in the literature of where the mosque faced. And that gave us just over 20 different mosques. Every one of those faced south of Jerusalem. Not a single mosque during that time period faced Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And when I drew a map up from north, south, east, and west, they all face within an area of about 40 kilometers circle. I can get all of them in. Now, remember, not all of them are accurate, so they're all somewhere in that circle. At the center of that circle is the city of Petra.
So you've got these mosques from different angles. So tell me some of the places where you found these mosques in terms of modern day nation states. Where would we locate these mosques?
In Amman, Jordan, I should actually bring up we have a database. It's on the internet. The film we made about this is called The Sacred City. So if you go to the sacredcity.ca, it's CA because I'm Canadian. So I've got a Canadian website. You can go to the data, you can bring up the website, and then you can look at all the data. If you need or want a book, people can get this book here, Early Islamic Qiblas. It has all the charts of all the mosques inside. And so when we're looking at the Petra mosques, I mean, I'm not very good at pulling things off the top of my head. So
that's absolutely fine. I mean, you wrote the book, so these are equivalent to your notes.
Yeah, these are my notes. So, I mean, there are just there's a mosque in Egypt. There are a number of mosques built by the Umayyads. So we can go to. I should have the database up here. Sorry, because I don't have. I mean, this is. I'm just going to hold this up. I don't know if people can see. That's the circle around Petra. You can see all the lines that come down in the Petra region. So there's two circles, a wide one and a narrow one. So I don't know if you can see the dotted circle around the outside and the narrow one. One of the questions is how accurate can they be about Petra? So I'll just give you an idea. We have mosques in India, in Syria, in Egypt, 2 in Jordan, Yemen, Israel, Iran, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Oman, and 1 off in Uzbekistan. So those are just the ones right there.
So what we're saying is that there are a number of mosques from around the whole region that are all pointing towards Petra.
That's right.
And what time period are these mosques? Within what time period have they been constructed? Did you say?
The first 100 years of Islamic history.
Okay, so we've got now 2 strands of evidence. We've got this Armenian historian who speaks about Mecca as being somewhere other than where we think of Mecca today, which we would now call Petra. We have these buildings which are all pointing towards Petra, and then. As I understand it, you've pointed out that the kind of geography that is described within Islamic literature, the Quran and other Islamic sources, their descriptions wouldn't match the Mecca that we have today, but they would fit better with Petra. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Could you expand upon that a little bit?
Okay. In the book, there are 50 different points under this, so we won't have time to go through all 50 of them.
Yeah. Just a few examples of.
Well, for instance, it talks about the environment of Mecca having fruit and having clay and having crops growing and so forth, and just all those sorts of descriptions do not fit Mecca in Saudi Arabia, which has sand and rock. And so, it talks about Abdullah, the father of Muhammad, going out and digging. And the word for the clay is teen. It's a heavy teen, and it means a clay, heavy clay. You have to work it. It is certainly not ramel, which is sand. And so, I mean, there's those kinds of descriptions that are there. There are lots of earthquakes that take place in Islamic history in that city. The Mecca is not in an earthquake zone. There's description of the high side and the low side. Muhammad often entered the high side and went to the low side of Mecca. You go to Saudi Arabia today, it's pretty flat. So what does that mean? But that fits into Petra. There was...
Are you talking about a city that's on a slant, that's built on a hill?
That's right.
On an elevation.
That's right. And there's talk also of...
City.
Okay. There's also a word they're used talking about thaniyas. Thaniyas are very narrow gorges that people could go in and out of the city. And there were a number of different thaniyas that people could use. And you come to Mecca today, and there are mountains on one, mountains on the other, and there's some valley, but there's nothing that fits the thaniyas that are there. Another thing is talks about ancient buildings being there. So there were houses, there were walls around the city, there were temples there. It talks about Hubble's temple. It talks about the temple of Allat and Dushera and some of these others in the history. And this is Mecca in Saudi Arabia is far too far south for any of this. We haven't found any evidence around Mecca or in the greater area of Mecca that anyone worshiped Dushera. If you go north, you find, once you get up in the Petra area, you find temples to Dushera. You find people would write on the rocks in different places some prayer or something about Dushera or about Allat. So all of these temples and the building itself, like having the city, and it's supposed to be a merchant city, it's supposed to be walled, and it's supposed to go back all the way back to the time of Abraham. And can we find any of that in Saudi Arabia? I had opportunity to talk to different Saudi archaeologists, and they explained to me that there was no archaeology in Saudi Arabia that goes that far back. They have not.
And when you say in Saudi Arabia, do you mean in Saudi Arabia in the city of Mecca?
In the city of Mecca, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, we can all see the pictures of Mecca today. They've got skyscrapers everywhere. There's new builds. I think it was just last year one of the giant cranes fell over before God sent the locusts upon the city. You know, like they're building. So if the Mecca that we know of today is an ancient city, we would expect to find lots of archaeological evidence of human civilization in that city. We would expect to find the same like with the city of which is a much older city from an archaeological point of view than Mecca. We've got archaeological facts that we can see in the British Museum and many other ancient cities as well. Like in Jerusalem, every time they dig up a foundation ready to lay down a block of flats, they're finding stuff. So if the Mecca that we think of today is this ancient, large, well-populated city at the time of the 7th century, we should expect to find evidence for it aplenty. Is that a fair conclusion?
I think so, yeah. And it was a sizable city. It could produce 10,000 men in its army, so it had to have been a sizable place.
Was Petra in the 7th century a city large enough to produce an army of 10,000 men?
Petra was occupied from way back. I mean, we have records of it from before the time of Christ. Different people have ventured guesses, and I would be reluctant to give a guess. I've seen guesses from 20,000 to 40,000 people lived in the city. Plus, in Petra, there are villages all around the area, lots of farmland. Although it's in canyons, but there's lots of areas that were farmable, especially on the northern side. And if you go up to some of those areas, you'll find archaeological digs where they're saying this is one of the first places that grain was domesticated. And you can see, I mean, lots of history going back. So I have no problem with Petra producing, a lot of different people. And it was on the trade route as well. So it was a center of trade.
The silence, as it were, in terms of, like, you would expect Mecca to be full of these archaeological museums testifying to the history of the Islamic tradition, demonstrating how pre-Islamic pagans were living there, demonstrating their culture. As someone who's invested in the study of archaeology, what does the silence of the absence of all these artifacts state to you?
I mean, but as has been said many times, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So we have to be very careful. My point is that pre-Islamic times, there is very little evidence. Now, some Muslims have gone back and they've located certain buildings and they have said, oh, we think this is the house of Muhammad's wife, Khadija, or we think this is the house of, and so forth. So there are some older houses, but to date them, to go back, even to the time of Muhammad is difficult. Certainly, I have not seen or heard of anything before the time of Muhammad. I don't know if that makes sense to you. So to me, that just, where is this ancient city? It should be here. I would expect it to be there. When I come to Petra, because that's where all the mosques are pointing, suddenly everything is there. A good example are the stones that surround the sacred area.
Just before you continue, we've got people are saying that you've got an echo on your side. So if you could turn down your speakers.
I am turning it down, yes.
Because we're coming back through on the speakers back onto the microphone.
Right. And if not, I will go to an earphone.
Yeah. Okay, so let us know, guys, if that doesn't improve. So you were saying that when you get to Petra, everything is there, and you were going to give a good example of.
Yes, the stones that surrounded the sacred area, it was marked off. So you knew at this point you've entered into the sacred Masjid Al-Haram, the area now where you're safe. When you come to Petra, there are 20 large stones, as large as this room I'm in, and two or three stories tall, that mark all around the city, the sacred area of the city. They're there in Petra. No one has ever found those in Mecca. So that's just an example of things. I can go into Petra and point them out. I've just, in a couple of days on my YouTube channel, I think Tuesday coming up in 2 or 3 days, we will put out a new video that will introduce a new tool, and it takes you around Petra and shows you all the different places. It's called the Islamic Places of Petra, and that tool you have to click on the link that's on the website, because it's a big long link to get to that tool.
So to review, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the case that you're making. We have non-Islamic writers that are describing Mecca as being somewhere other than we think of Mecca today. We have the fact that the earliest mosques that have survived from the earliest times of Islam don't square off to the Mecca that we think of today, but they square off to Petra. Yep. We have the descriptions within Islamic sources, and I'm guessing by that you are referring to the Quran, you're referring to the Hadiths, and the biography of Muhammad. Is that correct?
That's correct, yep. And even the commentaries, yep.
And the commentaries as well. And they are describing a Mecca that just does not fit the topography of the Mecca we think of today, but does fit the topography and the sort of demographic description of Petra in the 7th century.
That's correct. And
then we also have this weird silence. Along with that, we have a weird silence about the lack of this great civilization, this great town of Mecca that could produce 10,000 people in the 7th century as an army.
It's an archaeological silence. It's also a manuscript silence. in
Go
that
on.
none of
More
the other nations around talk about this great city. And you would think they would, because it was a merchant city and it, interacted with all of these, civilizations around. Surely they would mention it. Surely they would put it on the map. It doesn't get mentioned for another 100 and some years. It's, I think, 740 before the word Mecca even appears in Western literature.
Now, hold on. You 140. So, but
That's
there is a city
outside of Islamic literature.
Yeah, but you're saying, and but you're saying, how would you respond to the charge? Because some people will charge you of this, that you are simply crowbarring Petra into the Islamic historical narratives found in the Islamic sources, that you're just forcing Petra into the text. How would you respond to that?
Well, I have to just go back to the original Qiblas and say, why do they point to where, why are they facing Petra and not Mecca in Saudi Arabia? Why, for the first 100 years of Islamic history, can I not find a single mosque that faces Mecca in Saudi Arabia? So, I mean, what happened is, after I realized this, then I went to Petra, and I had studied. I'd lived near Petra. I'd studied the Nabateans. I'd written one book by that time on the Nabatean people, and so it just struck me like the descriptions. And as I was reading through the Islamic histories, and I began to realize I have to read all of the Islamic histories and all the things that are written there, because I need to disprove this. I mean, I didn't believe it when I first came up with it. And you don't want to come up with something and come out and announce it and then, get shot down. That's no fun. So I needed to read everything. And as I read through everything, it's like, oh, I can go to that place. Oh, I understand that. Oh, that makes sense. For instance, in Medina, when they go off to attack the Quraysh in Mecca, they go north out of Medina. I mean, Mecca is the south, Petra's to the north, but they travel north. So there's so many different stories like this. The people who go on the pilgrimage, and they give the number of days, and they could have, like from Iraq, they could go to Petra, but they could never get down to Mecca in Saudi Arabia in that time period. So, I mean, that's why we came up with 50 other indicators in the book. Now, the 50 don't stand on their own, I don't think. Okay, they are supplementary to support what we found in archaeology.
Yeah. Okay. No, I get that. This is a much broader case. In terms of how your hypothesis is received in academic circles that you're aware of, I'm not expecting you to be aware of every possible academic response. How would you say that the people that you know in academia treat your hypothesis?
Well, first of all, I think almost nobody knows about it in academia, because I've not published in journals, and I haven't, and I've talked to different scholars, and they have come up with one objection, and the biggest objection is that this is too big. It's too wide. And they would say, as a scholar, I can speak about, because I have studied and I know about, the Quranic manuscripts. I can't talk about Qiblas because I don't know anything about it. Okay, so they refuse to say anything. Somebody else comes and says, well, okay, but I'm an expert on this archaeological dig I'm doing. And so I can talk to you about that dig, but I can't speak to the wider picture. And so this is the problem I've run into is it's very difficult to find anyone who wants to take the time and energy to tackle the big picture. I mean, there's several things here. Second is that when people initially hear it, they don't believe it. When I initially came up with the idea myself, I didn't believe it. It's just this can't be true.
It's a big thing to swallow. I mean, I am generally conservative in my views, and so whilst I want to be open-minded to your hypothesis, and I want to interrogate it, and I'm going to, and part of this discussion is to give me a bit of an intro to that. beyond what I've read and heard. I know that you've won certain people over, like Dr. J. Smith, and there's a team here in London that I'm familiar with, DCCI, that use your material and things like that. So you certainly, within some Christian circles, you have a following. I haven't yet made my mind up. My own point of view is to be skeptical of radically new ideas. That is my default position. I'm a skeptic of anything that sounds too radical. And I know that Dr. King, who is a name that I know you're familiar with, he's really got an issue with you. I mean, Dr. King seemed to be in a bit of an apoplectic rage with regards to your theory, describing you as the son of missionaries, as if there should be some kind of insult. And do you find this kind of, and I would say that that's Christophobia, as if somehow because you might be the son of missionaries that discredits you in some way? That's certainly.
Although my parents were not missionaries, and my father was a scholar, but he was in a wheelchair all his life and didn't travel. So that's I'm sorry, I don't know where that came from. My grandfather was an electrical engineer back in the late 1800s, but also, well, he went as far as South Africa and into the United States. He never traveled to the Middle East, so I have no idea where he got this idea from.
I can hesitate to guess because I do evangelism amongst Muslims, and immediately they say, you're a missionary. You're just paid to do this. So my guess is some students who wanted Dr. King, or some professors who wanted Dr. King to respond to you, introduced your literature to him as he is just the son of a missionary. He's some kind of Christian fundamentalist. So they probably presented you in that way. And then Dr. King never bothered to check, but then just went along with it. I remember. Go on.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I remember people accusing me of being a missionary. Like I'm not a missionary. I'm just accused of being a missionary. And it's just a trope that in certain circles, within the Muslim community, discredits you the moment you have that label attached to you.
Yeah.
But
let me just say, I remember my friend Abdullah once, when they accused him of being a missionary, he said to them, look, as a Muslim, do you want everybody in the world to be a Muslim? And they said, yes. And he said, well, I want the same thing for Jesus. Okay. And so just like you and I and everybody, who are followers of Jesus, we would like people to discover what we have discovered.
Amen.
Okay. But that doesn't, the idea of missionary in the Middle East, that somebody has gone around and promoted this, is that there are missionaries out there who will bribe you, who will give you things, who will. I've never met these people, and I don't know who or where this idea comes from. Obviously, there must be a couple people out there like that, but it's not as a twisted thing. Anyway, I don't see it as negative. I've seen missionary hospitals and missionary schools, and many universities are even started by people who went out even professionally under the church and wanted to see education started. So it's
Amen.
not as bad a term as some people make out. But anyway, that aside, Dr. King has not liked what I've done. And I've had to go back and study Dr. King a little bit to try to figure out where is he coming from and why does he have such a negative reaction.
So just on that, if you could, what is the general antithesis presented by Dr. King against your thesis?
Okay, Dr. King, as his expertise, and he is an expert, and he is a scholar, his expertise is on the medieval Islamic mathematicians. So you need to understand the word medieval here means starting by 900 AD and going up to 12, 13, 14, up till the end of the medieval era. That's his expertise, and I will not argue with him over his expertise in that area and with those scholars. He really is an expert. However, while reading those scholars, some of those scholars discuss that there is a problem with the Qibla direction. So they recognized it during the Middle Ages. They talk about the earlier period where mosques faced strange directions. And so they tried to figure out, and they gave ideas. Often they were writing a mathematical treatise. It was a great big thick book, but the first few pages would be addressed to the earlier days, and they said they didn't know how to calculate the Qibla back then. And so they came up with different ways. And so some of those scholars writing in Yemen came up with different solutions than, say, somebody writing in Samarkand or somebody writing over in Cairo. So depending on who these medieval scholars are, they usually put in a couple pages just to say, this is probably what they did back in the early days. And so Dr. King, though, has picked up those ideas, and he has accepted them as this is the way it was done. And so he became very upset when I came along and began talking about Qiblas. What was interesting is that some of the students sitting in his classes were writing me. The first time I was aware that Dr. King was getting upset was long, long ago, and they wrote me and said, "Do you know he's ranting and raving in the classroom about you?" I had no idea that I had offended him. I had offended him because in this book here, talking about Qiblas, I never once mentioned him.
Just hold that up a bit.
That's Quranic geography. And so when I wrote that, I never mentioned Dr. King. It just never occurred to me to mention, because he was writing about medieval people. Later, when we get to this book here, then suddenly now I've got to address Dr. King because he's quite upset. And I pointed out that in the Encyclopedia of Islam, he lamented that no one had ever done a study of the Qiblas and the Qibla directions around the world, and no one had ever made a database like of all these different. And that's what I was working on, So I thought, okay, I should be in his good books, but I did not come up with the same conclusion that Dr. King came up with. Now,
I just want to clarify some points.
Okay.
So that everyone can keep track, and I want to make sure that I'm following what you're saying. So Dr. King is an expert of later medieval Islamic mathematicians writing from the 9th to the 13th or 12th century, correct?
Yeah. I mean, he makes mention of some later ones up to the 14th century. Yeah.
Sure. And then what you're saying is that these medieval mathematicians, they are recognizing in the 9th and 10th and 11th and 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, the same thing that you have noted, right, which is that we've got early mosques, facing in the wrong direction. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that these mathematicians and scholars from these different centuries of the medieval period were each coming up with their own solutions as to why that was, depending on where they were.
That's right.
Could you explain some of their theories as to why these early mosques were facing the wrong direction? Okay,
they some of the suggestions they gave is when people went to the Kaaba building. I'm just going to use this as an example of the Kaaba building.
So we're now looking down on the Kaaba building.
That's right. And so imagine that somebody comes and he's walking around, and maybe he's standing here praying. So he's thinking, and he's looking north. And so when he goes back to his mosque, he's going to be thinking about when he stood here. And so he's going to orient his mosque facing that way. Actually, the Kaaba focuses up a little bit. So he's gonna face his mosque this way. Somebody else might be looking at this angle down here. And so he's thinking, oh, well, maybe the Kaaba should face this way. So when he goes home, he faces the Kaaba in that direction.
How would they make that kind of referencing?
Well, that's up to Dr. King to understand. Now, I had to go back also and figure out, how did Dr. King reason this, because in my mind, people went around the Kaaba. They circle the Kaaba. So, you're not just standing in one place the whole time and then taking that experience home. But Dr. King, he got a hold of another scholar who wrote some papers with him in the early days. And this is Dr. Hawkins. And Dr. Hawkins came along and helped him. It was very interesting to read those early papers. Now, Dr. Hawkins is very famous in the UK. He is the guy who went to Stonehenge and studied Stonehenge and came up with the solution in the 1960s that it was probably an astronomical observatory of some sort. So he's the guy who first recognized, on solstice, the sun lined up through here, and on another solstice, maybe here. And so he's based on astronomy. Astronomy is his big point. He wrote books. He wrote Stonehenge Decoded. And so he was famous back in the 60s. Dr. King wrote his first papers with Dr. Hawkins. And Dr. Hawkins came down and they looked at this thing called the Kaaba. And they said, well, you know what? If you've got this side here is maybe facing these stars here, and this side here is facing these stars, and this one here is, and so in the early papers of Dr. King, it's the orientation of the Kaaba building itself that they used for interpreting. This is how people must have orientated their mosques.
Got you.
Okay, now Dr. King even goes farther and said some places, maybe there's a Roman road, and so they built it parallel to the Roman road. Okay, or maybe the whole city is laid out this way, so they laid it out this way.
So the medieval Islamic mathematicians didn't have a universally decided answer. Absolutely. What's happening is Dr. King is coming along later, seeing all of these different answers by different medieval mathematicians, and then he's sort of bringing it all together as if it's one answer. So he's doing it ad hoc, post hoc.
But he can quote all these sources as his source material, and it's very impressive. But most of them that he's quoting are 500-600 years after the fact, people looking back at how was this building oriented. Now, Dr. Hawkins, and I've got this in one of my videos on my YouTube channel, he said there's a lot of questions. And he was very, what's the right word here? I mean, skeptical of all of these solutions in his paper, and said a lot more research needs to be done. So after that, Dr. King then begins to write, but he just keeps working away at the same theory without being skeptical. So Dr. King has a theory, and it is based on what medieval people said, and so I'll give him credence for that. I've just come along and approached it from a different point of view, and suddenly things start to fall together. So Dr. King has a theory. I have a theory. I respect him and his theory. I wish he would respect what I'm working on. Unfortunately, he decided just to attack. And I've almost decided to ignore him from this point on, because he just keeps hammering away at the same things.
I might have an issue with Dr. King if I ever meet him, because I don't like Christophobes and people who speak of people as descendants of missionaries, if that's some kind of pejorative, should probably be looked at as the same way as an Islamophobe. And I just wonder how the university feels about employing people who speak derogatory of Christians in such a fashion. But how would you respond to the thesis? And those are my words, Dan, those are not your words. I'm saying that, not you. Just so, how would you respond to Dr. King's thesis? What is your response to his arguments? How would you respond?
That's a good question. I'm just trying to think, because I've responded in many different ways. I mean, I come back and point again to the Qibla directions that I've discovered, and when I laid them out, now it gets even more confusing. We've given a very simplistic view of the Qiblas, because during the first 70 years of Islam, all the Qiblas are united, all pointing towards Petra. Then comes what I call the time of confusion, because suddenly Mecca enters into the equation, and
So
then
after 70 years after Hijrah.
that's right. And then you have a guy by the name of General Hajjaj, and he builds a mosque, and it's built in his honor. And he chooses another place. It's exactly between Petra and Mecca, and he calls it the Between Mosque. And the whole area is called the Between area. And then wherever they build mosques during his lifetime, as he has been the ruler of the Eastern Empire of Islam, is the height that he's got to next to the Caliph. So he's second sort of in command. There are East and West rulers. The Caliph is here, and there's two guys underneath them. All of the ones being built, I should be over here, being built in General Hajjaj's area, which is about another 20 mosques at this point, all point to what I call, and what Islamicists have called, the between position. And then you get a fourth Qibla come along, because when they get off to North Africa and over into Spain, these are the Umayyads who still survive, not the Abbasids who have taken over. And so they choose another totally different Qibla, which is kind of what I would call an African Qibla. And it's pointing down into South Africa in a line that I have noticed was exactly parallel to a line between Petra and Mecca. And there is many mosques over there as well. I've noted more than 20, and I've got people sending me now evidence of more mosques as well in those areas. So we end up with 4 different Qiblas.
So there are mosques pointing to 4 different points of reference.
Yes, but you have to put them on a timeline in order to see that the Petra ones are here. They overlap with the Mecca, then starts here and goes on until the present. Petra ends after a while. They also overlap with this very narrow period of the between mosques, and then we have these parallel mosques over in Africa. So we end up with 4
where do the
different
parallel
ones.
point to? Where do the parallel mosques point to?
They don't. They all face about 155 degrees south. So whether it's here or here or here, I mean all the way across, and they're actually aligned parallel to Mecca, and a line drawn between Petra and Mecca. If you draw a line there, then they use that line. You can put it all the way across. That's a very interesting position. I've got a video or 2 on it as well, and talk about who started it and why they started it, and how it developed over time. And eventually that ceased, and the Abbasids became to rule. Well, the Islamic Empire moved around, and eventually Mecca became the only place. Now, the advantage I have is I have tools that have not been available previous to this time. We have GPS units, so I could go out when I was in Jordan. We'd go out and we could find maybe somebody wrote something on a rock, and I could take the GPS coordinates so that a future archaeologist could go out in the desert and find that exact spot. So that is a whole new thing. I could check the directions of mosques. Also, we have satellite photos, very helpful. So we can look down from space now and look at these buildings. We can even measure the buildings, and we can then go over and measure the direction that they're facing. And there's lots of different tools developed by the Japanese, developed by the Americans, and different satellite systems, different measuring tools. And new satellites are going up all the time with incredible measuring devices in them, because we're now measuring the carbon output, and we're measuring what's growing. They can look down and see what's in the field by the color and the radiation. And so the amount of tools that are available from space are absolutely incredible.
Okay, so I just want to refocus back onto our building up of the evidence. So we've got the early mosques that point towards Petra. Then we've got some now. Is the order this? Mosques point towards Petra, mosques point towards the middle place, then mosques point towards Mecca, and then some mosques point randomly elsewhere. Is that
Your
did
order
I
is a
get
little
that?
wrong. Mosques point towards Petra.
Yeah,
Mecca is basic. Mecca and between come about the same time,
they come
very
about
quickly followed by the parallel mosques.
the parallel mosque. So focusing in on this emergence of Mecca from the pointing of the mosque. I just want to take a step back a minute about. We know that the Arabs were able to navigate the desert using stars. Am I right? I've not got that wrong, have I?
Yeah, no, that is correct, because merchants, I
What
mean, there's great flat plains there, and they would leave a city and they would arrive at the other side of the desert at their destination, not off by 500 miles.
Yeah, because the desert is like an ocean, so you navigate it in a very similar way. It's a flat expanse for the most part, but essentially it's featureless, just like an ocean is, and you use stars to navigate. So people who can navigate, people who can trade, because Muhammad was a trader.
Mm-hmm.
So so we know that the early Arabs were trading, wherever they were, whether they were in Mecca as we think of it today or Petra, they would have been traveling by stars. So if they wanted to point their mosques to Mecca as we think of it today, they would have been able to do so in the same way that they would have been able to navigate to get from one city to another. Is that a fair conclusion?
That is correct.
So it is therefore fair to conclude that if they are pointing their mosques to something other than Mecca, it is either by accident, in the sense that you've got you've got a architect, for a want of a better term, a builder who's building a mosque but has never done any traveling, and so doesn't know how to reference the stars, or doesn't make any reference to the stars. In which case, we would expect to find mosques just pointing in any random direction, but not coordinated to a particular focal point. But what you're saying is we're finding mosques very widespread at different points, focusing in, which implies deliberate choice.
That's correct.
Right, good. I'm understanding your argument. So the emergence of Mecca, then, why do you think that Mecca begins to emerge as this new focus? Why not cling to Petra? Why be ashamed of Petra? Why change Petra to something else?
Well, that's where I had to, using the archaeology, came up with a rough date. Hey, this is where things looks like they begin to change. All of a sudden, I've got a Mecca mosque, like something happened. Then I went back to the histories and began to read through to find out what was happening at this time. And I've had to do that many times. I did the same thing when the between mosques. It's like, well, something must have happened in the histories that created this. And so at the same time, something had to happen. That's when I discovered a man by Ibn Zubayr, and he was in what's called the Second Civil War. The First Civil War was over Ali and the descendants of Muhammad, so it gave us the Shia and the Sunnis. The Second Civil War, what happened because the Caliph at that time moved his capital city from Medina up to Damascus. Now, that created a huge uproar in Islam, because as long as he ruled from Medina, it's one of the holy cities. Everybody was happy. Moving the control of the whole empire and the whole government and everything to a secular city with no Islamic history in it created a huge problem. Now, it solved many problems for that caliph because Damascus is more central. Communication is easier. He was struggling down in Medina to be able to control the empire. So basically, the empire was controlled wherever the caliph was. By setting up in Damascus, he created a central government, and suddenly Islam begins to merge on the scene, and other nations are noticing it now. It's not like a bunch of Bedouin are coming out of the desert and raiding and taking over. Suddenly they have occupied Damascus. I mean, that sent shockwaves around the world, and suddenly Islam is noticed on the stage. But at the same time, Muslims are unhappy, and so there's an immediate rebellion, and the rebellion occurs in three places. It occurs in Mecca, which I believe was in the city of Petra still at this point, because the new Mecca has not come on the scene. They rebelled in Medina, and they rebelled in the city of Kufa.
Just stop. Medina, when you say Medina, do you mean Medina as we think of it today?
Yes. Yes.
So there was the Medina that we think of today hasn't changed in your hypothesis. It
Not
is
at
in
all. No.
Think of it today. Okay, continue.
Okay, so we have this rebellion. Ibn Zubair is in the holy city, which I believe is Petra. He rebels, and the people there set him up as a caliph, ruling from, and it makes sense. It's the holy city, and why not he be the caliph and forget those guys in Damascus? He begins fighting, and at some point in there, he tears down the Kaaba. I don't understand why. It says he tears it down, and he puts the black stone into a stand with silk over it. It describes this stand. The histories here, now remember, they are being written by the Abbasids, who won the war eventually. And so the historians can only write what is good for the Abbasids. And the Abbasids were struggling to keep the whole empire together, and so they have to write things that will keep the empire together, not cause division. So there are things they cannot say, but they do say Ibn Zubair got many horses and camels and baggage. The idea is to move people over to another place. I believe that's when the black stone was moved, because it's already been taken out of the Kaaba, and then we have the rebuilding of the Kaaba, which I believe happened down in Mecca in Saudi Arabia.
So
that's the thing that's in the middle, where suddenly Mecca comes on the scene.
So your hypothesis there indicates, one, that the black stone is a foci of cultic devotion, which would seem to be supported by the idea, by the way that Muslims treat the black stone today. They go around it, they kiss it. They don't kiss the other rocks of the Kaaba building. They kiss that particular meteorite. But the other thing is that hypothesis, what you're describing, would seem to imply that there's more than one Kaaba building. What evidence do you have that there's more than one Kaaba building?
Well, I only believe there's two Kaaba buildings, one in Petra and one in Mecca. I've not found evidence of other Kaabas. Different historians have written on them, and I've gone back to try to figure out why are they writing this. And some have said, well, they were in Yemen, and it's a book on kinship in something of the tribes in Yemen. Can't remember it exactly. This is the guy who wrote it in the 1800s. I don't think he had good access to Yemen at all. And it's a big puzzle even into this day. And a lot of people have said that book is very inaccurate. But that's where he said, well, there's a red Kaaba and there's a white Kaaba and so forth. I think he got confused. There was a red idol of Hubal and so forth. So the evidence, I haven't seen it. And I've asked a lot of scholars, can you help me find where is this other stuff, this other Kaaba? In my computer, all my libraries in my computer, I can go in and search through Ibn Hisham and Ishaq and Al-Tabri and all of these guys. I've got dozens and dozens of different books there, the Encyclopedia of Islam, lots of other modern tools as well. Just put it in, and I just a few months ago, I did it again. I'm like, I can't believe it, because I came across it again, and it's on the internet on Wikipedia as if there really were all these other Kaabas. And I said, I've got to be able to find the original source. I haven't been able to find it. So anyway, I think there were just two Kaabas, and I think that's why in some people's mind, well, if there's two, there can be three, there can be four, there can be whatever. We have a Kaaba in Petra, a Kaaba being developed in Mecca.
What is your evidence that there was a Kaaba in Petra?
When I go to Petra, as we said, we're looking for things. I began with the question, when during the war with Ibn Zubair, the Syrians brought in a trebuchet. It's a manjanik is the word used in Arabic, and they bring it in, and they're able to hit the Kaaba building. Now, usually, and I point this out in the film, I mean, you have a big city, and then if you've got a Kaaba at the end, I mean, a trebuchet here, he's only going to be throwing it in on the end and knocking down houses or whatever. How did he hit the center? Well, Petra has got the city walls come right down into the center and then go back out again because there's a riverbed, a dry riverbed that comes along here. By bringing their trebuchet up there, they could put the trebuchet at that spot, and they could hit in a circle there. You go over there and look, and there's the foundation of the Kaaba building. It's what it looks like to me. What solidified it is a man named Azraqi writing the history of, again, around 200 to 300 AD, is writing because his family has looked after the Kaaba building over the years. He gives the measurements of the original Kaaba building during Muhammad's lifetime. And when I measure that foundation, it is exactly the right measurements.
Dan, you say that this gentleman that you mentioned who looked after the Kaaba building, was this pre-Islamic?
Yes. No. This would be before the time. His name is Azraqi. He writes Akhbar al-Mecca. I've only ever found it in Arabic. And this is, in here, he gives the measurements. And he says this building wasn't square. All four sides have different measurements because being square wasn't important to them at that point. When measure that... Sorry, I can tell there's a bit of a lag. So this gentleman is giving the dimensions of the foundations to the original Kaaba building that was there before it was destroyed and they rebuilt. Right.
Continue from that point.
So it's not exactly square. It's and none of the sides. I took Azraqi's measurements, measured this foundation that's there, and it fits exactly. All four sides fit those measurements.
Fits what? Sorry, what does it fit?
The foundation of what I felt was the Kaaba building in Petra.
Okay, so you found the foundations to a cubicle building in Petra, the dimensions of which fit perfectly the description to the foundations. Now, the gentleman that you've mentioned, what date is he?
Oh, I'll have to go back and see. My guess would be about 300 after the Hijrah. He'd be writing about the same time as Al-Tabri and Bukhari and all these others.
So he's writing about the foundations to the original Mecca in 300. So this is after the Kaaba has changed and the position has changed.
That is correct.
So he's unaware of this change. He's describing the foundations to a building.
I think he is. Again, you're reading in Arabic. It's very difficult to figure out if he's aware or isn't. A lot of these writers, I think, were hinting at things that were known, but they weren't allowed to write a lot of this openly because they were all being sponsored by the government, and the government was saying, you must write to help unite the people and make us all one.
Okay, so let's imagine that your theory is true. Let's do a thought experiment.
Well, let me just go back to that building because there's more things. What did the archaeologists find digging in that area? They came up with trebuchet stones. Okay. They've been collected up and put into off to the side, but there they are.
In Petra.
Another thing, during the fighting, Ibn Zubair moved to a structure near the Kaaba where he fortified it, and that was where he did his last fighting. When I was out there visiting some years ago, the Brown University was excavating, and one of the professors there took me around and showed me different parts of the excavation, and he pointed out in this part what's called the Great Temple. It's not a temple, that's a whole long story. Many of the monuments in Petra are misnamed because of things, but anyway, he was showing me in this building they fortified. They took parts of the building and they fortified in the doors and the walls. He said, we can't figure out because no battle took place here. in history. It had to be the Saracens during this time, and he said we can date it by with earthquake had knocked down part of the building, and we can date parts, date this when they built this. And he said there was no fighting taking place there. And that's true. According to traditional history, the fighting was taking place in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. But when you come to Petra, there is evidence that there was a fight, evidence the trebuchet was there. There's the Kaaba building is there. There is a temple right beside the Kaaba building, which is what historians tell us. The temple to Hubal should be right there beside it. And you can find a temple right there. They also describe the Hijr wall was not attached to the Kaaba building. And so the wall went around the compound and it curved around the grave of Ishmael. And it wasn't till Ibn Zubair rebuilt it that they say he attached the Hijr wall to the Kaaba building. You don't see that in Petra, but you do see that in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So there, at this point, it's difficult when you're reading which Mecca are they talking about, because both of the name Mecca, but you can go by the history and by what they're describing in the architecture, and you can see suddenly we do have the Petra one here, we have the Mecca one here, and they're talking about, the Kaaba was in the corner of the compound, and so along came Abdul al-Malik, and he knocked down a whole bunch of buildings and put it in the center of the compound. You see that in Mecca and Saudi Arabia. You go to Petra, you still see the Kaaba in the corner of the compound. So it's interesting to read the two accounts.
Questions. The sources that speak about the trebuchets, the sources that speak about the battles, are these the Islamic sources?
Yes, this all comes from Al-Tabri or some of the other historians.
Okay, so we should be able to we should be able to find evidence of this battle in Mecca, the Mecca of today that we think of, but
right.
But we don't, because how many people do we know roughly? Any guess as to how many people were involved in this battle? Was it a big battle or was it just like a phony battle? I mean, were we talking hundreds involved or thousands involved?
Yeah, probably hundreds or thousands. I mean, they sent up a large army down from Damascus to attack Ibn Zubair.
Right.
And
so
it's described as where the battle took place, and one of them's described as the button of the city. That's the belly of the city, right in the core of the city where they were fighting at the very end against Ibn Zubair, and he's fortified in this building. You go to Mecca, we don't find the fortified building. We don't even find foundations of it. We don't find any of the temple that's there. I mean, I don't know. Nothing's there. There's no temple to Hubal or Dushera or Allat or anything like that. Nothing
reference to the temple of Hubal, that again is in Islamic sources?
Yes. Hubal plays a very important role in the history of Islam.
Okay.
Pre-Islamic times.
I would love to get into a discussion about the influences of pre-Islamic paganism on the practices of Islam, but maybe we can do another show later on in the year about that. I just want to do a experiment with you.
Okay.
If your theory is true, then there should have been evidence, I would think, of Muslims objecting to the idea of or opposing the idea of this move from Petra to Mecca as we think of it today. Do you have any evidence of Muslims objecting to this relocation of the sacred city?
Okay, I think there are several things we can look at. First of all, in our mindset, we think Western ways. Back in those days, many of these tribes were nomads. And so when they moved off to Iraq to fight, or moved off to these other, they took their tents, their wives, their kids, their children, their camels, everything, and went and moved along. So it's not like they left people at home. So many of the original tribes, these men went off into battle, like the Battle of Yamama. 600 men died that had memorized the Quran. Islam was in shock. I mean, so many major people had died in the battle. So we get this slowly. The people are dying in battle. Many new people are joining them from Iraq, from Syria, from other places. And so there's fewer and fewer people to object. Second, we have something very unique in Islamic history, and Al-Tabari mentions them. Bukhari talks about the traditionalists and the reformers. And it's very clear, you read about there's these two different groups. They have never been well understood until we suddenly understand the Qibla problem. And there would have been reformers who were saying, let's go to Mecca. There would have been traditionalists who said it all happened in Petra. And so we have in history this dividing of Muslims into two schools. They weren't dividing along Shia and Sunni lines. There were traditionalists and reformers in both groups. And so eventually the traditionalists die out because it begins with some of the caliphs of the Umayyads. They are supporting the traditionalists. Let's just accept Mecca and Saudi Arabia. And I think that push was because Mecca had earthquakes. Mecca was in ruins after the war. Mecca was full of pagan temples. And the Black Rock was already, I'm talking about Petra. Petra had all.
I click that.
Yeah, okay. And the Black Rock was already in Mecca. They had already set up a Kaaba there. People were already going there on pilgrimage. For 6 or 7 years, the pilgrimage stopped because of this fight. But then it picked up with two pilgrimages, sometimes 3 or 4 pilgrimages, led by different people at different times. Islam was in chaos. And then you have this thing about, well, let's accept a between Qibla. And then these guys over here saying, well, let's just make it parallel because we can't decide which direction to pray. We're just going to all unify around this Qibla. And the others coming, well, we can just pray to the Qibla in heaven, or we can. And so Islam was divided into many different camps. If you read the histories, every other month there's another battle with a rebellion. All the problem is coming up from inside. And so all these struggles are going on. And it's not until you get to Abdul al-Malik, who really, al-Walid before him, really puts his foot down. And he really starts killing people and insisting that they unite around a common theological base. Abdul al-Malik comes along. He creates Arabic as the language because it wasn't even the language of the empire. He creates coins. So a lot of people say, well, this is the guy who created Islam. Well, he is doing everything he can to unify people, and he's unifying them around Mecca. He's going to Mecca and he's he's building things, he's constructing, and so forth. So so you have this upheaval going on. It's not until after this time, 100 years later, it all settles down. By force. Abdul Malik and and these guys, they all do it by force. So about 100 years later, there's an uprising comes along of people. It starts in Bahrain, and there are people there who begin to say, but hey, have you heard? Going to Mecca is not right. Mecca is not the original. It's not the place we're supposed to pray to. And so they start preaching against Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And then they go out and start trying to convince pilgrims who are going to Mecca, you shouldn't go to Mecca because Mecca is not right. Eventually, they get so upset, they go to Mecca, they kill a whole bunch of these pilgrims and stuff their bodies down the Zamzam well. Then they take the Black Rock and they take it away from Mecca, and off they go back into the desert. And that Black Rock is gone for over a decade. They hold the Black Rock, but eventually they are being opposed by everybody. Their numbers go down, their economy goes down, and eventually the Abbasid caliphs pay them to get the Black Rock back. And so it was returned. One day, they don't know who came to one of the mosques, and it was in a bag, and they threw the Black Rock into the mosque. But when it was returned, it was smashed into 7 pieces. If you go to Mecca today, you can see the Black Rock is actually 7 pieces because it was smashed by people who said we do not accept Mecca as the place of pilgrimage. That's the last of the revolts against it. But after that time, it sort of all settles down, and everybody has accepted Mecca in Saudi Arabia.
Okay,
We have 600 AD. You have a guy named Yakut comes along, and he goes around. He's a geographer, and he finds all of the original places. And he says, "Oh, up here on the side of a mountain, this has got to be Aqaba, where the market was, and over here." And he's the guy who gave us the locations of all of the places around Mecca today, and the cave and everything, because he's the one who found it. And it's interesting to read his record because he oftentimes has discussion of why he thinks this place is the place and his arguments for it, because obviously it wasn't clearly known before he came along and established it.
Okay. So when was he writing, sorry? After
He's
Hijrah?
writing 600 after the Hijrah.
So 600 years after the Hijrah, someone's coming around and he's noting down where all these places are that are written in the histories that are written 200 or 300 years after Hijrah.
Yeah. And he's another 300 years after that where he's writing them down.
So we got historical problems there. Now, Dan, I want to open this up to our audience, allow them to ask you some questions directly. I'm gonna, guys, don't start writing your questions right now. Wait until I say, please. And hopefully, what I'm going to do is
hopefully they're still awake.
Yeah, hopefully. And then I'm going to pick some questions out. Please put a question mark at the end of your question so I can see that it is a question. Otherwise, I'm not going to do it. And if you put a statement, we're obviously not going to respond to it. I want to impress upon you that Dan is my guest. So if you start asking silly questions, I'm obviously going to avoid them. And if I click on them by accident, I'm just going to ignore them. And so is Dan. So, guys, if you would like to ask a question to either me, but preferably to Dan, with regards to this hypothesis, now's your time. So state who your question is to. Try and keep it on topic. I think you should direct them mainly to Dan, to be fair. And I'll as I find questions, I will answer them. Otherwise, me and Dan will just look gently at our cameras. Give them a few seconds to think of their questions. I mean, I have a question for you, Dan, which is that in terms of your theory, your hypothesis, there seems to be an obsession with this black stone. People are taking the black stone, people are moving the black stone, people are reassembling the black stone. Anyone could say that is creating an image. What was the focus? What was the importance of the black stone before Islam, if you know? I mean, I know that's not necessarily the focus of your study.
Yeah, it goes back to the earliest record that I know of goes back to Jerome, who was in Bethlehem and writing translating the Bible, I think, into Latin. Anyway, Jerome was writing there, and he sends out some monks from where he's working to go up among the Arabs and to try to evangelize them. And so there's an account of a man named Hilarion who goes up with a couple of these monks. And when he comes back, he describes the different cities where he's been. In one place, at this point in the Negev, there was a big festival, and there was this black stone that people worshipped, and it was on a golden base that was brought in there. So we know a black stone was part of the worship at this time, and possibly moved from place to place. We don't have a lot of good record until we come to the very early time of Muhammad, when he's a young man, before he's got any revelation. And they are reconstructing the Kaaba, and so during this they have rebuilt the building, and they have taken the black stone and put it down, as they redid it. Now they got the cement and all fresh and ready, and an argument breaks out who has the right and the honor to pick up the black stone and put it in the Kaaba building. They have an argument. Nobody can agree which tribe. And so an older man there says, let's wait and let Allah decide. The next person who walks into the Kaaba complex, that's the person God has chosen. And guess who was the next person who stepped into the Kaaba complex? It was Muhammad. And so Muhammad then got representatives from each of the tribes, and they put a cloth down. They each held the corners. He rolled the black stone onto the cloth. All the tribal members lifted it up holding this cloth, and he shoved it into place. That was before he had received his revelation. And so he knew he was chosen of God to put the stone in its place.
So Muhammad was venerating the black stone before and after his prophetic.
Yeah, well, if you go ahead, skip all the way to when they come back with the Muslim armies and retake the holy city, he tells them, destroy all the images here and destroy all the idols. There were over 360 sacred objects. But he cannot have them destroy the black stone, even though it was an idol before that time, because that's how he was chosen of God. And so as you read that story, you realize it is very important to Muhammad, because that was the beginning of his sacred career after that, if I can use that term.
Okay, so we have a question. I'm going to put it on screen. Hopefully you can see it. Tell me if you can see it, Dan. Can you see the question?
Yep.
Yeah, so I'll not read it to you. Everyone's an adult. We can all see the words. If you would like to respond to the question.
Okay, states my book has no academic publishing. States therefore it demeans your entire theory. In the publishing world, there are lots and lots of different publishers. And there are academic presses, which are set up by universities. There are other academic presses, which are independent. And then there are lots of other presses that are now publishing books that were not traditionally academic. And so there's been a whole change of the way things are done in publishing academically. So, no, my book is not published by a university press, and it is not an academic book in that way. Therefore, but even if it was, you could still ignore it. There are many books that are published in academic presses, which later are just sort of ignored because maybe they weren't as good as people originally thought they were. So being published by an academic press doesn't guarantee that the book is good. A good example for that is the book Hagerism, which was published by Dr. Crone. And Dr. Patricia Croney and Michael Cook published this book. After some years, they came and said, well, we were a little bit young and a little bit naive when we did that book, and they retracted some of the things that were in their book Hagerism, because it took a lot of knocking from a lot of people. So even though it was published by two highly regarded scholars, and even though it was published by academic press, today it is not the whole theory behind the book is not taken that seriously. Now, that doesn't mean there's not some good research. So sometimes people use it. I've gone to look to see, okay, they had an argument in there. How did they base it? What was their source material? So I can go find the same source material. So that part is still useful. But having an academic publisher doesn't guarantee that the book is without fault or that the book is actually academic in nature.
Okay, brilliant. We have another question. A radical moderate. I've been told by the tech guy that I have to read out the questions because some people might just be listening and I can't argue with the boss. Question for Dan. The execution of Uthman. Do you find it a little suspicious that the man who brought them their Quran, id est Uthman, was murdered in his own home while the Medina townspeople went on Hajj?
Okay, that's a little bit outside of my area, but it does point out the volatile nature of early Islam. There was a great deal of infighting of people against other people, tribe against tribe, a lot of assassinations. And so you have this problem. Well, Ibn Zubair was having his revolt. I mean, the caliph dies, the new caliph is elected, 40 days later, he's dead, and they have to go get another caliph. I mean, everybody wants to be in charge of everything, but it was a very precarious position. And so I don't know what I would say it was suspicious. It was a fact that a lot of these caliphs died very quickly and prematurely because there was a lot of just volatile nature and a lot of suspicion of each other and fighting going back and forth, whether it was Shia or Sunni, or fighting over the Qiblas, or fighting just because this tribe got ahead of the other tribe. There was a lot of jealousy that's you can see between the different tribes as well. So I appreciate the question, but it's not an area that I can answer very deeply.
That's fair enough. And just to bring to add on to your own answer, when Ali was opposed and murdered, a whole branch of Islam was born that ended up with different doctrines, a different salat, a different theology entirely from Sunni Islam. And I'm not making an argument about which one was the original version of Islam. But the point is, what I'm stating is, at this very early stage, these civil wars did produce radically new movements within the Islamic world, bearing in mind that your hypothesis is based on the idea that a second civil war spurned a radical change within Islam. But whereas the Ali radical change, if you believe the Sunni version, spawned a distortion of Islam and Islamic belief, your hypothesis presumes that the distortion became the norm. So there is precedent even within Islamic history that wars and civil strife can lead to a new development and understanding of what Islam is and how Islam works. And I think that's something that gives credence to that part of your argument. So the next question, Dan, if the hadith that says that the Kaaba is only for eventually identifying Muslims from non-Muslims, why all the idol worship, etc.? I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure what that question is asking.
Yeah, I would be nice to know where in the hadith it says the Kaaba is only for identifying Muslims from non-Muslims. I think what we're saying is that there was an area around the Kaaba building. There was two circles around it. There was I'm going back to the original one in Petra. There was an immediate wall around it, which was that was the area right around the Kaaba. Then there was this much greater, I can't see it on the screen, these stones all around the city saying, so that this is the sacred area inside. So when you came into the sacred area, inside were Christians and polytheists and Muslims. All three existed there. We go to Petra and we can see the polytheists had their temples. The Christians had their churches as well. So all of these were existent there. So in the beginning, there was no idea that this is exclusively for Muslims. I do not see that idea until we come to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And it was later on that they began to say these two cities, Medina and Mecca, are to be sacred to Muslims only. Not true in the original stories of Islam. Muhammad had even his nephew, I think, was a Christian. And so there were Christians and Muslims and polytheists all mixed together at the beginning. And so there was no separation. So the idol worship all comes from the polytheist side. they worshipped idols, and they were there alongside of Christians in the early city. Does that help?
Okay, I think you made much better sense of that question than myself. Sorry, KS. I think also the fact that you've got churches being referenced in the Islamic literature again identifies a more developed city, which would require more archaeological presence in the archaeological record, which we should be able to find in Mecca. But the Mecca of today, but the none seems to be forthcoming, and that's suspicious, at least.
Yeah.
Question, Dan: does history mention Medina existing, and how far back? I'm guessing by history we're talking about maybe history outside of Islamic sources.
Okay. Yes, Medina does go back in history. Now, Medina is an interesting situation. I think I hate to pull the number out. I have seen a list of maybe 40 different names the city of Medina has gone by over time. Medina was never a walled city. Medina is in a low place, and so water comes down into that low place. And so it was always swampy, and it always had disease in it. So I mean, there was a lot of complaints when Muhammad took Aisha and others and moved to Medina. They complained a lot about the sickness, about the water, about the sloughs, about the disease, about the bugs, and all this kinds of stuff that was in Medina. It was not necessarily an attractive place. Now, where we pick up on Medina is we know that people went there to escape. And so the first wave of people that went in were from Israel 70 years after after AD. 70 AD, when the Romans attacked, many Jews were dispersed. One of the places they went, and there were a number of tribal groups that went to Medina, and they settled there. A few years later, several hundred years later, a group came from Yemen. After the fall of the Marib Dam in Yemen, people had to leave. The estimates up to 50,000 people left Yemen at that point. Came up through the Arabian Peninsula. Many of them stopped in Medina. Others went up and went over into Egypt and went all the way across North Africa. And you can find people with Yemeni roots all the way over to Morocco. So this is that full. This is before the beginning of Islam.
So there are sources outside of Islamic history that mention Yathrib, Medina.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was an area, but it wasn't a united area. People settled in it, and so there was no. I don't even know that there was a central city. It was an area where there were Jewish people and it was agricultural, and it wasn't a big city until Islam came and Muhammad worked at making it a city and getting everybody to work together. And if you didn't work together, you left, or in the case of 900 Jews, I think they lost their lives there until he got that city to work together and became Medina, the Islamic city we know today.
Okay, so next question. This one's directed to me. Bob the Builder Circle Films, what do you make of the latest discoveries of early Islamic inscriptions from 78 after Hijra, which mentioned the rebuilding of the Masjid Al-Haram found in Humma al-Numur, northwest of Taif? Now, I am aware of some cave kind of inscriptions that speak about the building of a mosque. Partly I came across them as I was learning about your own work, Dan. However, I don't really know enough to make any comment, but I wonder if you're familiar with this and whether you can add anything.
Yes, I've been using this as ammunition for the last, year or two. As it became obvious to me, people would say, well, Muhammad didn't exist. There's no name of Muhammad. Well, here is something that's written down on the rocks. It's dated to 78 after the Hijra. It gives a complete shahada that's there. There's also many prayers and blessings and requests from God that God would bless. And it's dated as the year 78 after the Hijra, and is dated as the year that Masjid Al-Haram was constructed. where there is bena, constructed. And so this gives us the name of the Prophet Muhammad. It gives us the Shahada. It gives us Islam as a religion, and it tells us that Masjid al-Haram constructed in. It doesn't say in Mecca, because it just says that it's Masjid al-Haram is constructed that year, and again it's close to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, so we can assume it's talking about Mecca, and it fits the timeline perfectly. This is when they did more than just have the black rock there and the Kaaba. Now they're actually constructing something sizable, and also the Caliph is involved. Others are involved in making this an actual focus of worship.
So what you're saying is it fits your timeline?
That fits my timeline.
So, and what you're saying is that this is evidence of construction work connected to the development of Mecca, of the one that we know of today,
right?
Which would fit with the fact that there isn't a lot of archaeological evidence showing a trading city prior to this period, but would fit with the idea that Mecca, as we know of it today, was really developed after Muhammad, after his time, and that would account for the lack of evidence before, but its presence now. Yep, brilliant. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Next question. Has Dan considered the role of Mesopotamia and Central Asia and the people from there in early Islam, and what has he learnt? Now, I'm guessing this person knows a little bit more about this topic than I do. He's probably asking a question that you can make sense of, but I don't know what he's asking there. So
this is coming from Sneaker's Corner, so I don't know if it's a particular person that I've met before or not. So I was interviewed by Sneaker's Corner earlier. And of course, questions like this seem to hint at things. The role of Mesopotamia and Central Asia and the people from there in early Islam. I've been tracing and trying to trace down some of the roots of people from India and the influence of Indians on Islam, but no, I don't know a lot. I do know that Nabateans before the time of Muhammad were merchants, and they traveled far and wide. So there were many Nabatean merchants in Iraq and in Mesopotamia, and that is clear. There are many that were in Alexandria, went to Egypt. There are even Nabateans who went up to Rome, and there's Nabatean temple up there at the port city of Rome and so forth. So there were those in India as well. So they were traveled far and wide, and I think influences worked their way back. And we can see those in the city of Petra in the architecture. There's some Indian architecture, there's some Egyptian architecture, there's a lot of Greek and Roman architecture and so forth. So, I mean, yeah,
we would expect
Pardon me?
We would expect to see that also in an ancient Mecca, if an ancient Mecca really existed.
It would be nice, but
pagan period of other civilizations, because the pagans weren't exclusive.
Yeah. But it's Mecca was a pristine, clean place. I think when Ibn Zubair showed up, there was a valley, there was a well in the valley. He moved in. I don't think he was there. I think the guys who were under him, they were getting the rock as far away from those guys in Damascus. So even if he lost to the holy city, he still had the rock, And so he went down there and they built this thing. I mean, put it there. They didn't build Masjid al-Haram right then. They put the rock there. And I think people started coming. People all from around the areas. Oh, you hear the black rock is here. The pagans would show up and want to see it because this is an important idol. Other people would want to come. Muslims would want to come as well and pray there and kiss it because the black rock was there. And so immediately it would have become a focus just locally. And so they would need to have put up, places for people to stay and how to feed people. And that well would have been busy getting water out. And suddenly this whole commerce starts to build around it. And then a few years later, the Caliph sends down some people and they actually build a proper Masjid al-Haram, whatever that looked like. and suddenly they were in business in Mecca.
And,
They have a pilgrimage going, and Petra is just fading from view.
and we see the development of settlements and cities around pilgrimage sites in medieval Europe. So that is sociologically not a new phenomena. That's quite a normal phenomena, actually. We see things like that in medieval Europe, which is relatively a similar time to what you're talking about. Now, it's my show, so the last question goes to me. I want to ask, in terms of the Islamic literature, one of the reasons why I have a doubt about your hypothesis, why I'm not on board necessarily with what you're saying, but I am genuinely interested in your argument, is if we've got this Islamic literature that speaks about Mecca and speaks about the life of Muhammad, and if someone was going to come along and sort of alter that to try and relocate it to Mecca in Saudi Arabia as opposed to Mecca in Petra, how do we get away from this idea that this is a grand conspiracy and that someone's coming, who would have had control of the text, who, when, and how did they manage to manipulate the text, the textual part of your argument, or unless I'm misunderstanding, that Mecca is in Saudi Arabia as opposed to Petra?
It depends what texts you're speaking of. Because remember that Mecca doesn't appear in the Quran, except in one place. And it's still argued whether that is actually saying Mecca or whether it's not. So we have the holy book that Muslims are following. It talks about Masjid Al-Haram. And so they built in 78 AD, they built Masjid Al-Haram. So that's what they're building there. So it's not a question of
78 after Hijrah, not AD.
After the Hijrah. So it's not, almost all the dates I use are after the Hijrah. That just makes more sense to me. I get lost in these Christian dates and other dates. So, again, where were all the people? The tribes have gone off fighting with the Caliph. That's why you come along and say, well, okay, where's Ibn Abbas? Well, he came from Humayma, just 27 kilometers or 27 miles south of Petra. That's where the house was. They moved en masse to Iraq, and you just find the ruins there of the place where they were. Why? Because Iraq was where Baghdad was, and they set up that new the Abbas house and the Abbasid dynasty, and so they moved en masse. A lot of people moved en masse. When Muhammad came in and they destroyed the city, which I think was Petra, a lot of people were killed, and so it ended up being an Islamic city. Other people left the area, and because of this army coming through, and then the army went up and kept fighting going north. To keep that army marching, you have to ask yourself, how do they get so many men to keep that front moving farther and farther and farther away? And one of the things was that they had to keep recruiting people from at home. So there's not as many people at home as you might think. Second, there are no manuscripts for the first 200 years of Islam outside of the Quran, which doesn't mention the name of the city. And then when we do get the mention, everything's being written by the Abbasids or it's being edited by the Abbasids. So, I had somebody write me this week, and he was using Ibn Ishaq, and he was, and I said, well, please don't use that because we don't know where Ghulamin, the French guy who did the translation, I think he was French. Anyway, we don't know where he got all these things from. It's better to go back and find the source in Ibn Hisham and deal with that, because that's a much more acceptable piece, manuscripts we can go back to. Even though we know it was edited, we can go back to when it was written, where the life of Muhammad, that book that's in English out there, people need to realize that is only in English. That is not an authority to base your study of Muhammad or of early Islam on. You've got to go back and use other sources.
When was it edited?
There are sources.
When was the Ibn Hisham edited?
60 or 70 years after Ibn Ishaq wrote it.
Which is, when did Ibn Ishaq write it?
Oh, you want the actual...
Whilst you're looking
the good thing about this book, if I can get it up there, because we got
there we go. Quranic
at
geography.
the back of this book, and you can buy this book electronically. At the back of this book, I put together a timeline, and it gives pages and pages of timeline of what goes on. It shows when mosques were built, when battles took place, and so forth, and when books were written. You see books on there as well. So, I mean, I can quickly go back and give you the date of when an actual book was written.
While you're doing that, Dan,
Yep.
I'm going to give Junud Allah the opportunity to write a question. So, Junud, if you could just write a question that you'd like to direct to Dan, and we'll write it again. So, write your question, Junud, and I'll ask Dan to respond.
Let me just go back. Ibn Ishaq is writing in 761, okay, which is 144 after the Hijrah. And so that's when he wrote the book, but we don't have a copy of that.
Much later than the Gospels.
Sorry?
Much later than the Gospels, but that's a separate point. So, Junud Allah.
Okay.
Second chance, mate. If you want to rewrite your question that you want me to ask to Dan, you've got the last question. Just give him a minute or two to get his question out. I'm not going to take questions from anyone else, and then we'll close the show. Okay, and then I'll
give you that one piece that you asked about Ibn Hisham, and he's writing in 833, and it's 218 after the Hijrah, and that's the copy we have.
When 230?
This is Ibn Hisham. So it's 218 after the Hijrah. His is one of the earliest that we have.
Wow.
As Ibn Ishaq, we don't have. So what Gulaman did is he took quotes of it when people quoted him, and he tried to rebuild the whole account using quotes rather than, but Ibn Hisham actually said, I have the text, but because it has grievous errors in it, I've corrected it.
Interesting. So, Junud Allah, this is your third time of asking. If you want to ask a question to Dan, you need to write down your question so I can see it, and then I will pose it to Dan. This is the last time I'm going to ask. So, Junud Allah, if you want to ask a question to Dan, you need to write it down so I can see it and post it, please. Whilst you're doing that, Junud, I just want to say, Dan, thank you so much for your time. This has been a real pleasure. I'm going to go back over this video and make my own notes, study material a bit more. Not convinced just yet, but you're definitely touching on something interesting. And I would hope that in the future, maybe we can do another show where we probe a bit more into some of this as I get to grips with it a bit better. And also, I'd invite you, maybe as someone who studies archaeology, maybe we could put a show together that looks at archaeology and the Bible. How would you feel about that?
That's a possibility. I have some videos on my YouTube channel that address that topic as well, where the Bible and Islam work together, like the archaeology of David or Solomon or Isaiah and some of these places. And we could look and talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's fair that we do a show on the archaeology of the biblical narrative as well. So I believe Junud has written his question. I'm going to put it to you, Dan. So this is the last question, guys. Isn't the most parsimonious explanation that the first generation of Muslims didn't have geographical coordinates to know where Petra or Mecca were? So in other words, they just didn't know.
Okay, and this is the argument that Dr. King uses, and he says, I won't accept your argument unless you can prove how they did the measurements. And in my mind, okay, there's two things, and I've asked several people in this area who are doing some research, and so please, you're going to have to give us time. In this book, though, if you want, I suggest there is an entire chapter on what did the Arabs know about using the stars for navigation and for finding direction. I suggest you read that. You might be very surprised at all of the things that they knew and things that they did, and the measurements that they could take and they could make. And so the proof, though, is in the Qiblas. If they were just random Qiblas, that data should come up. There is Professor Shum is working on writing a paper right now, and I've seen several people working on the statistics, because they're saying, look, the statistics, do they show these 4 different Qiblas, or are they random Qiblas? And so they're working through that. And what I've seen so far, it is unquestionably that the data shows there were 4 Qiblas. And so even though they might have been out by 3 or 4 degrees on an average, which means some may be 5 and some may be 1, I think they average between 3 and 4 degrees accuracy. That is extremely accurate when there are 360 degrees to consider. So they could get down, and so all the mosques would fit within a 60-kilometer circle, and many of them would hit within even a 20-kilometer circle on the inside. So, I mean, I look at the accuracy, and I'm saying they did know how to point their mosque and how to face them in the right direction. And not all of the solutions are mathematical. And this is where Dr. King starts laughing at me, and where I have other people writing me who have done their doctorate degrees on other studies who are saying, but no, this is absolutely true. As an example, back then you had carrier pigeons. They had set up when the Caliph moved to Damascus. They soon set up a carrier pigeon mail route. And then later they had one in Baghdad, which would send carrier pigeons back. Because carrier pigeons, you take them from their home, you take them to another spot, you let them go, they go up in the air, they make a circle around, and then they go directly back to their home base. They've done experiments, they're doing experiments all the time, and pigeons are very accurate, and all you had to do was take some pigeons from Petra, go over to where you want to build a mosque, let them loose, and they were going to go up, make a circle, and go that way. Just do 5 or 6 tests, and in the end, you're going to go, no, that's the direction we're going to go. You didn't even have to be able to know the sun or have to make any measurements. So there are other methods that can be used. So, I mean, it's not like they had no clue. They certainly had a clue. They also knew geometry. They could make directions, and so forth. What is also interesting is that suddenly they wake up, and within a 60-year period, all of these mosques aim at the between position, and then they suddenly quit. Something is going on here. And why did they all face Petra, and then suddenly that fades out, Mecca becomes the one? So, I mean, to me, it's more than just, if they didn't have a method, we would have seen much more variety. And that's why mathematicians and statisticians are getting involved in writing these papers, because this is something that they can write about using statistics to say, no, these were deliberately chosen directions of mosques. And please do read what we've written about how they told direction. You might be fascinated to see the science that was used behind in measuring the North Star and knowing exactly how far north and south you were. You would be surprised to know that they walked, and as they walked, they counted their steps and the methods they had for doing that. So they could measure their distance, they could measure the height from certain stars in the sky. They had a compass with 220 stars. Their compass had 220 points, not 360. That's Babylonian. Okay, and so you have these 200, maybe it's 224, 220. I'm going to have to, I get the number wrong in my head, but these are all where stars come up on the horizon and where stars set on the horizon. And so they knew exactly when they stood, they could face north, and they knew exactly how many degrees were out on the horizon where they were, and they could pinpoint exactly where they were. So, I mean, they had an incredible amount of knowledge and able to just, from observing things, put together their direction. And so they could head off with camels, and here, and they could end up 500 miles away and arrive exactly at the city where they wanted to arrive at without getting lost in the desert. And we're talking this going way back before the time of Islam. We're talking Nabateans doing this at the time of Christ. And at that time, Nabatean merchants went as far as China. And that is in records, and we have the records of where they went to China and when they came back and everything. So they had traveled very widely around the world.
And the point, Junod, I think at the end of that is, we're assuming in ignorance that the evidence doesn't support. If people can cross deserts and trade and find cities, then they can build buildings that point in the same direction of their traveling journeys. But on that note, guys, we're going to stop. There is going to be an after show. Dan, we're going to release you with our blessings, and thank you so much for your time. We'll keep you in our prayers, keep us in yours, and we've appreciated having you on the show. God willing, we'll do another one in the future. And guys, you know the books, the documentary Sacred City, Quranic Geography, Early Islamic Qiblas, if you want to explore Dan's ideas more. And God bless and peace be with you.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, guys, sorry, just for everyone else, we'll be back in about 5 minutes to do an after show. Take care.